Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Asia Society and today's event, Reimagining Supply Chains in the Age of Geoeconomics. My name is Philip Ivanov. I'm the CEO of Asia Society in Australia. Before we begin, Asia Society acknowledges that many participants in today's event are dialing in from locations that have traditional owners and custodians. I'm speaking to you from the land of Boon Wurrung and Wurundjeri people of the East Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge their traditional owners of this land and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to welcome and acknowledge any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, or First Nations people joining our webcast today. Thank you to the Victorian Government and Global Victoria for supporting this event, which kickstarts a new project for us, which will explore supply chains in Southeast Asia. So as a part of Asia Society's new strategic plan and our Trade Smarter strategy, we're thrilled to be partnering with Global Victoria as part of their Trade Alliance program to better understand how businesses can better navigate and evolve in a more unpredictable trade environment in Asia and beyond. Now, since the pandemic began, nothing outside the public health response has captured the attention of CEOs, boards, and policymakers all around the world than supply chain disruption. The pandemic-induced supply chain issues have also been further complicated by geopolitical and geoeconomic competition between states, and not just between the US and China. So today we're going to dissect some of these issues and what business leaders and policymakers need to watch out for in the coming months and years. Now, in today's event, we're also excited to be hosting the Australian launch of the Asia Society Policy Institute new interactive tool that maps out the foreign investment and supply chain policies of 17 economies in the Indo-Pacific. And we will be also looking at the geoeconomic competition across the region and what that means for Australian business. Now, before we get into today's event, some quick housekeeping instructions. Our panel discussion will run for about 30 minutes, and then we'll move to a Q&A. Please type your questions through Q&A box at any time, and we will answer as many of them as we can towards the end of the session, and preference will go to Asia Society members. Now, if Asia Society was a TV production, which we kind of are, given our programs are available online and around the world, today's program would have won the Emmys because of its all-star cast. So first of all, our good friend and colleague, Wendy Cutler, is Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute and the Managing Director of our Washington, DC office. Wendy joined ASPI following an illustrious career of nearly 3 decades as a diplomat and negotiator in the office of the US Trade Representative, where she also served as acting Deputy US Trade Representative. Dr. Jeffrey Wilson is the Research Director of the Perth USAsia Center, and he specializes in the regional economic integration of the Indo-Pacific and particular expertise in politics of trade agreements, regional economic institutions, and Australia's economic ties with Asia. Earlier this year, some of you have seen the report that Jeff published called Adapting Australia to an Era of Geoeconomic Competition, on which we draw in our discussion today. Finally, our session will be moderated by Mukund Narayanamurti, General Manager, ASEAN at Austrade. Mukund leads the Austrade team across Southeast Asia, covering 8 offices and supervises over 100 staff. And previously, Mukund was the CEO of AsiaLink Business, which is Australia's national centre for Asia capability. So welcome, everyone. Thanks again for joining today. And it's great to have you all with us. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. For a full view of the expertise of our speakers, and please be sure to click on the link we're sharing with you now to read their full bios. Mukund, over to you.
Philip, thank you for that very warm welcome and introduction, and also for setting the scene on the topic of discussion today. Can I also offer a very warm welcome to Jeff and to Wendy and to all of our participants. Very much looking forward to your questions and comments and have a really insightful conversation. Jeff, I found your paper, as Philip has also referred to, on adapting Australia to an era of geoeconomics competition, deeply insightful. And before we delve into some of the finer points of that paper, very keen for you to set the scene by just sharing with us what you mean when you speak of geoeconomic competition and what the different forms of geoeconomic competition are.
Oh, thanks very much, Mukund. Now, look, geoeconomics has become this really new and hot buzzword, particularly if you're in Australia. You've seen this used a lot more over the last 12 months than we might have ever before. But it's a big term with a pretty simple meaning. It's the application of economic instruments for strategic ends as part of a foreign policy toolkit. So we're really talking about when governments use things like trade agreements, investment packages, their aid programs, not for the ostensible economic outcome that's written on the packet, but to try and achieve some kind of broader diplomatic or political goal. The easiest way to illustrate one of these is to talk about, say, a free trade agreement. Let's use the recently, almost completed Australia-UK FTA. Now, free trade agreements are nominally about an economic objective, lowering barriers to trade so that there's increased trade and economic activity between the partners. But in reality, we also see a lot of free trade agreements that are driven by broader political and relationship objectives as well. And that's been made very clear in Australia's UK FTA recently, particularly what we've seen with recent Australia-UK bilateral announcements in the meantime. And so what geoeconomics does is it really changes the logic of governments' foreign economic policies. They're not solely about the economic benefits of these policies, but they also have additional diplomatic and strategic agendas overlaid into the policy mix. We've seen a lot of governments add geoeconomic tools to their toolkit in recent years, and there has been a competitive element to it naturally. We've seen this happening in three different ways, I'd say. The first one is trade wars. The most famous is those started by President Trump during his administration, which launched trade actions against a number of countries, but most famously China. We've also seen a lot of things that we might say as investment races, most notably China's Belt and Road Initiative, an infrastructure package to connect countries in its near abroad back into its economy, but also matching efforts in that space from Japan, the US, even Australia in our Pacific Step Up program. And finally, we've also had the competitive multilateralism, where governments attempt to create new multilateral economic institutions to write the rules of the road for the global economy. The competition between the two mega regional free trade agreements in the Indo-Pacific, the TPP and the RCEP agreements, provides us a good case study of that at play.
Thanks, Jeff. There's a lot to unpack there, which we will over the course of this conversation. But really keen to now hear your thoughts on what you believe some of the recent drivers might be in our region for increased levels of geoeconomic competition.
Well, look, geoeconomics isn't something that's particularly new in a way. In fact, it was very common during the Cold War. The Bretton Woods institutions that we know and love, the World Bank, the IMF and the WTO, all actually started life as a geoeconomic strategy of Western governments in the late 1940s and 1950s. If you wanted to cast your dial back really far, you could argue that Roman roads built by the Roman Empire were their form of geoeconomics during late antiquity. But what we've really seen in the last 3 to 5 years is that geoeconomics has made a storming comeback and really come to the top of the foreign policy agenda, especially amongst governments in the Indo-Pacific in our region. Look, I'd argue the proximate return reason for the return of geoeconomics is great power competition. Major powers around the world are looking for ways to compete with each other for influence. And using economics and economic toolkits is a kind of low conflict threshold type way to do it. It's much easier and less conflict prone to use trade agreements or investment agreements as a way to struggle for conflict than it is for military tools, for example. And so therefore we see geoeconomics most prominently in the Indo-Pacific because the Indo-Pacific is the epicenter of great power competition globally. But another factor worth mentioning is China, in particularly China's state capitalist development model, which has a much greater role for government actors in the management of the economy. This means that the Chinese government, somewhat uniquely, has a lot more geoeconomics policy levers to pull. For example, it can mobilise its state-owned enterprises in the construction and infrastructure sectors to build major projects in Southeast Asia much more easily than a liberal market economy like the US or Australia could, where those companies are private sector. And so as China has looked to project its influence in the region, it's made particular use of geoeconomic tools because its state capitalist model has them at its disposal.
Really helpful to hear that perspective there, Jeff, on how perhaps our settings and the influence of private firms in our economy relative to other economies perhaps lend ourselves to being more susceptible to geoeconomic competition and also perhaps less able to lead from a geoeconomic perspective as well. Very powerful points there. Wendy, I'd like to bring you into the discussion. I know that you have a very exciting new tool to speak about, but perhaps a segue into that is to also hear your views on what you've noticed about how supply chains have been impacted by COVID and geoeconomic competition over the last couple of years from a US perspective.
Well, sure. But first, let me just say how honored I am to be part of this panel and to be, as an Asia Society member, participant on the other side of the Pacific. It's great to join all of you. You know, when I think of supply chains, I mean, it's only a matter of a few years ago where like people would, you know, yawn when they heard the term supply chains. Not interested, didn't affect them. And frankly, they seem to be working well. So why pay attention to them? And now it's kind of all the talk of the town. And, you know, it's interesting when you can turn on in the US these talk shows and people are talking about supply chains and why don't we have toilet paper and where are our face masks and why are rental cars so expensive? So I think people are really getting a handle and really becoming concerned and also aware of the importance of supply chains. And there have been many disruptions leading up to COVID, but I think COVID really underscored how many vulnerabilities there are in supply chains around the world. Now, these vulnerabilities have caused concerns for governments as well as for companies. What are the kind of disruptions we've seen through COVID? Well, first, you know, we saw lockdowns and Wuhan was the first city to be locked down. And guess what? It was an industrial hub for many key products in the automotive, electronics, and pharmaceutical sectors. And as a result, for example, in Korea, Hyundai quickly found that it couldn't get a key part and had to close some production lines. And this story has been repeated and repeated over again in the COVID world. We've also seen port congestions and the shortage of containers and ships kind of hanging out in the water waiting to get the space to arrive at the port and unload their ship. And we've also seen demand shifts, that the products that we wanted before COVID have really changed during COVID, whether it be electronics or medical equipment. We've seen trade explode, but really increase in sectors that weren't anticipated, and as a result, leading to even more shortages. So all of this kind of has led to supply chain disruptions, concerns among companies and governments, and therefore both have taken steps to address these vulnerabilities. I think one of the questions is, are these steps enduring, or once we get out of COVID, you know, are companies, for example, going to go back and just rely on cost and efficiency again, versus putting a lot of weight on risk mitigation? We'll have to see, and maybe we can talk about that more. But we at the Asia Society Policy Institute, when we looked at all of these changes and disruptions, we were trying to figure out how could we contribute to available knowledge in this area. And one of the things that struck us early on was that as companies were looking to relocate supply chains, governments were responding by trying to make their countries more attractive for investment. And so what we've done is put together an interactive digital tool, and perhaps I'm just going to show a few slides, if I can ask that the first slide be shown. This is available when you go to the Asia Society website or the Asia Society Policy Institute website. This is what we call the landing page, and it looks like a map of Asia, and indeed it is. But as you take your cursor and you point to one country, next slide, what you'll see first, and here we're taking Vietnam as an example, you'll see some just important investment data on that country, including stock and flow of investment over the past 10 years or so. You'll see a number of rankings in different international organization projects, including the FDI Regulatory Restrictive Index compiled by the OECD, the Ease of Doing Business by the World Bank, and other tools as well. Next slide. And in addition to that overview, and this is really the heart of the tool, what we have done is kind of catalog all of the announcements, or almost all of the announcements. Hopefully, we've gotten them all by countries, either measures that they've announced or that they've actually implemented to attract these supply chains that are moving, to attract production, both with respect to sourcing and final production. And we have right now in our web, in this tool, we've covered 17 economies in Asia and about 180 measures that have been announced or implemented since 2019. And we break down these measures by the type of measure, whether a tax incentive, taxes are lowered to attract investment, subsidies or financial assistance, regulatory red tape relaxation. And we've categorized these both by the types of measures, as well as whether the measure affects the whole economy as a tax break to all sectors, or does it just affect specific sectors that certain countries are trying to attract, such as the ICT sector. So maybe that's the end of the slides, but I encourage you to go to our website and to check out this tool. I think it will be very useful, both to policymakers and companies, as they try and navigate through the supply chain conundrum everyone's facing, and see where, if they were going to move their supply chains, do any of these measures kind of tip the scale and therefore direct their investments to that country. So that's all. I'm sorry I spoke for so long, but I just wanted to put that on the table early on in the program.
That's very helpful, Wendy. Thank you for that context. If I could just ask a couple of questions on the tool itself. I'm personally obviously delighted to see that all 10 countries in ASEAN are a part of the focus here in the region. I found that the tools focus on the ease of doing business, the investment climate, the policy mapping, as you just highlighted, to really drive flows into each of these countries and specific sectors, to be really, really helpful. I wanted to know, will the tool also provide, if not now in the future, perhaps some hard data on labor and productivity rates? Because often that is also an important factor in determining, the cost effectiveness / productivity of actually reshoring.
And that's a great question. The short answer is no, not yet. And let's just be honest, when companies decide where to locate, they take into consideration a lot of factors. Part of the factors, again, have to do with the existing investment climate, but steps that governments are taking to attract investment. But they also look at infrastructure, the labor market in terms of skill. They look at the age of the labor market. They look at free trade agreements the country is party to. So there's so many factors. We're just trying to get at one factor, which I think has just become more prominent in the COVID world as supply chains are moving around the region.
Very helpful, Wendy, and absolutely, it's absolutely necessary, because so many governments, particularly ones in economies that you're focused on, have offered one-time incentives, and it's really crucial that companies are actually aware of what these incentives might mean at this point in time. So it's an incredibly valuable tool. Thank you for sharing context on that. Jeff, I'd like to bring you back into the discussion and really start to build on Wendy's points by shifting the focus to really business. If you could share with us a little bit about what you see the impacts are for business on the ground in Australia and the Indo-Pacific when really the established global and regional architecture is threatened. Who are the victors from a more splintered international environment?
Oh, thanks, Mukund. Look, victors is an interesting word, and I think it might be easier to talk about the losers than the winners in this, because I wouldn't say these developments are positive for businesses or economic integration. But if we look at geoeconomics, one of the types of actors that struggles to deal with it most is open market economies. You know, countries that have deep trade and investment ties with others, and that's deeply integrated into their economic system, have a high dependence on open and rules-based markets for those relationships. But what we've seen with geoeconomics is some of the conflicts, like trade wars that arise out of this, tend to politicize trade and undermines confidence in global institutions such as the WTO or existing trade agreements. And so what we do see is that we find that economies that are more open relative to others are therefore exposed to more risk from geoeconomics than others. This is certainly the case for Australia, who over the last 18 months of our trade issues with China has learnt that we can no longer assume existing trade instruments like the WTO or the Australia-China Free Trade Agreement are going to give businesses protection and coverage in the way that we might have expected. It's also a challenge for small and medium-sized economies as well. And this is because these economies don't have the size and heft to fight with the big boys, so to speak, when it comes to geoeconomic conflict. For example, trade wars are almost always won by the larger party. And so this means that small and medium players are under unique threat because they're not able to fight and retaliate in some of these conflicts in the way that an economic superpower like a US or a China or an EU might be able to. I'd probably also on that list put business as a general loser as well, particularly businesses that are internationalized. And this is not simply multinational companies. Any business whose supply chain, whether that's upstream that brings in products that they use or downstream to their customers, always relies on trusted and rules-based mechanisms for those international economic connections. So with the rise of geoeconomics, we're seeing a new layer of political risk coming over the top of regional value chains and those trade investment relationships, which, coming on top of all of the COVID issues Wendy's already talked about, is extremely hard for businesses to manage. This has meant a lot more risk has had to be priced into operations in the past and has often led to a little bit more caution than we might have seen about international business strategies in previous years.
Thanks, Jeff. If I could really now start to bring in the Southeast Asian context here, building on the points that you just made. From your perspective, how has COVID and geoeconomic competition really disrupted and recalibrated in many ways supply chains in Southeast Asia? You know, which countries in Southeast Asia, from your perspective, have been particularly impacted? And actually, Wendy, I'd love to also hear your views on this particular question, perhaps after Jeff, because you've just done so much work through your tool looking at, you know, the 10 countries in ASEAN, in Southeast Asia. So Jeff and then Wendy, please.
Yeah, look, thanks, Mukund. And look, I would say if you're looking at COVID and geoeconomics, over the last 2 years, the biggest material impact on regional supply chains in the Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia is definitely COVID at the moment. You know, what we see in our region is that we have some very complex and finely sliced up regional value chains with a product that might be manufactured somewhere in Southeast Asia going back almost 10 steps of different countries involved in it. You know, these are very efficient supply chains, but they're also very carefully calibrated and often have limited latency to deal with shocks or issues or interruptions. I mean, Wendy's already discussed what some of these are: factory shutdowns, economic instability and changing forms of supply and demand, Shipping blockages, shutdown of Ningbo port in China, also the very unfortunately timed blockage to the Suez Canal earlier this year. Some of the audience may not know, but since before the pandemic, the international shipping costs have increased fourfold in the space of the last 18 months. It's now 4 times more expensive to send a container from one place to another than it had been. And generally, those impacts correlate with the degree of a country's exposure to COVID or its trade partners' exposure to COVID. So those impacts have been significant, but a little bit better for countries like China and Vietnam that have managed the pandemic in the domestic sphere a bit better. And those impacts have been more prominent for countries such as Indonesia that have had a harder time of doing that. But I would argue on that, and I'd be interested in Wendy's views here, but in the long run, and once we get into the post-COVID recovery and then rebuild phase, but some of those geoeconomic trends I was talking about will continue to be a lasting problem. The reason that we have dense and finely sliced regional value chains in Asia is because Asia has for a long time been a very open and very rule-governed economic region. And that created the stability and trust and reliability that businesses needed to develop those regionally networked business strategies. Events of the last year to 2 years show that this is sadly no longer the case. And as Wendy's discussed, we're going to see a lot of businesses respond with various value chain strategies that bring parts of the value chain back into safer places. That might be onshoring back to the home country, or it might be moving value chains around from riskier to less risky locations. This could mean reduced economic opportunities for Southeast Asia as some of those de-risking strategies get implemented.
I'm going to be a little more optimistic. I don't disagree with anything Jeff said, but I think it's kind of the way I look at things. First of all, I couldn't agree more that there are losers here right now, but I believe losers can become winners. And the way you can become a winner, if you're a company or a government that has experienced these vulnerabilities and have seen them firsthand, is to start planning now and taking steps to make sure that you're prepared for future disruptions. And we can all count there are going to be future disruptions. We'll get through COVID, but we've got climate change, weather, catastrophes going on. There'll probably be another pandemic, I hate to say. And as Jeff's mentioned, there'll be strategic occurrences, et cetera. Not to mention fires and droughts and other occurrences. So it's those that really learn from what's going on now. And I think one of the keys for a company, for example, is to really understand your supply chain. I mean, I heard from certain companies that they didn't even realize that they source certain parts only in one country, because it's one thing if you're just sourcing 4 parts, but nowadays, one company to make a product can be sourcing dozens, hundreds, even thousands of parts. And so it's really understanding your supply chain, mapping it out, and then trying to develop strategies to mitigate risk. And Jeff has touched on some of those strategies. It's everything from onshoring or reshoring. That has been kind of something, there's been a lot of talk in the United States, particularly in critical technologies, critical or essential goods, that we need to bring this production home. In certain products, maybe that's needed, but overall, I don't think that's realistic or it's going to happen. Diversification, and redundancy. Don't just rely on a product from one site. Make sure you have a backup or have an alternative source should your initial source not be available. Supply chains might be shortened or regionalized. I think Jeff just referred to that, and that could impact Asia. But overall, I'm probably pretty bullish on ASEAN because I think that it's an incredible market, lots of growth, young population, relatively young population, and just moving up the value chain. But I think it's those countries that really, take the initiative now and open and provide certainty and high intellectual property standards and get rid of, administrative barriers and, have uniformity in the way regulations are implemented. I think it's those countries that are going to, be the winners in the ASEAN region. But I look at ASEAN and, you look at the growth figures in terms of jobs and growth, infrastructure, et cetera. And frankly, digitalization, which we haven't even talked about. I think digitalization will play a huge role in making supply chains even more efficient. And ASEAN, in many ways, is on the forefront of that. So I know we're kind of in some dark days now, but I think looking ahead, there are reasons to, be optimistic, in light of some of the disruptions we're going to face, and we just need to admit we're going to face them.
Thanks, Wendy. If I could just build on that and really start to draw out then how you believe supply chains can really insulate themselves then from geoeconomic competition, and this idea of a trusted supply chain, if you can speak a little bit to that and really also share your views on, I'm naturally delighted to hear your optimism when it comes to ASEAN. So I'm really keen to also hear whether you think that you see supply chains sharpening and you expect them to become more regional rather than global.
Well, first, trusted supply chains in many ways is a key answer, a key response to geoeconomic concerns. And that is that you establish your supply chains with companies in countries that you feel comfortable with and that are like-minded. And I would argue in many ways, free trade agreements, whether it be RCEP or CPTPP or bilateral FTAs, in many respects, they are trusted supply chain agreements, because in reality, what are you doing? You're bringing the economies closer together. You're getting rid of barriers between them. You're agreeing on trade facilitation measures. Clearly, you could go further, and I would advocate maybe on CPTPP looking forward, maybe you actually have a supply chain chapter with product-specific annexes to deal with certain, products. But I think trade agreements go a long way in establishing trusted supply chains. Now, what would you add to a trusted supply chain agreement? For me, I think a lot of it is you're trading with these countries. You want to make sure that during disruptions, the borders between those countries or the flight pattern or the shipping lanes are kept open so you can continue trading. You work with each other and you kind of, if there are shortages, you come together and you figure out how you're going to deal with them. And maybe you even pool resources with respect to certain parts of the supply chain. But I think trusted supply chains are going to be an important strategy going forward. And even if companies aren't thinking of them, I think countries, governments will be, and will start kind of pushing them as they look to how they're going to decrease vulnerabilities in critical and essential product areas.
Thanks, Wendy. Jeff, if I could actually bring you into the conversation here to actually build on some of Wendy's points. You speak in your paper of 5 potential strategies that we can use to adapt as we move forward. And you, of course, touch on diversification, which Wendy's also touched on. And in your paper, you speak about how narrow basket and the analysis of which you've presented. And also you speak of, the concentration by industry as well in your paper. I want to pick up on 2 points, the diversification point, which is your first strategy. And then in your third strategy on the use of geoeconomic tools, you speak about how the export of capital can also potentially be used as a geoeconomic tool. But what are the limitations for Australia in this regard, where governments can't direct private capital flows?
Thanks for that, Mukund. Look, I think the diversification argument probably speaks to itself following some of Wendy's comments. And certainly it'd be familiar to a lot of companies in Australia and businesses in Australia that have over the last 18 months discovered they only had one customer, or discovered they only had one supplier for the first time, or one or two that weren't particularly diverse. And that's been true of COVID issues. It's also been through some of the geoeconomic issues around trade conflicts with China. And so there's a general acceptance now with the notion that one needs to have their eggs in a wider range of baskets to deal with those kind of risks, whether they're from a political origin or a natural origin. And government in Australia has done a lot of work towards that end. There's been a significant suite of trade policies from our Austrade, from various trade promotion strategies coming out of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, as well as a whole range of new free trade agreements, the RCEP agreement that will be ratified next year, agreements with the UK and EU. But I think the part of the geoeconomic story that's always been hard for Australia to deal with is the proactive element to this. How do we use our foreign economic diplomacy with others, whether that's our outward investment, whether that's our development assistance program, to try and be part of this? I think this is a bit of a cultural challenge for a country like Australia, because we have had a very liberal, open market view that the role of government in foreign economic relations is to tear walls down, negotiate trade agreements to lower tariff barriers and lower some of the other regulatory issues that Wendy's been talking about, and let businesses get the hell on with it. So the idea that governments need to actually shape those relationships is very challenging for Australia. The reality is it's not challenging for most countries in the Indo-Pacific region. We've certainly seen this as a large part of China's outward economic engagement through its system of state capitalism. It's as old as the hills in the Japanese system, which has multilateral development banks, large trading houses, other things that run these agendas. It's even familiar to the United States far more than Australia is. We would be one of the few countries in the region that don't have a fully functioning Exim Bank of the nature of, say, JOGMEC or JBIC in Japan, for example, or the China Exim Bank. So I think this is going to really require a bit of a cultural change for how in Australia we think about the role of government in terms of managing international economic relationships. I would be very concerned personally, I'd be interested in Wendy's views here, that we go too far. That governments say, we've got these geoeconomics challenges, we've got these COVID challenges, we're going to start taking over and very heavily intervening in how we engage with the world economically, which is really going to constrain a lot of the momentum and dynamism that comes out of those market-based exchanges, which is the reason that for 30 years Australia's been trying to pull all those barriers down. So it's really about finding a sweet spot. Is how can government get involved in these spaces to help manage that risk without getting so involved that they take the risk on and deal private enterprise out of what fundamentally is an international commercial marketplace?
Well, thanks for that, Jeff. It's certainly a very significant topic. I think the diversification discussion has been heavily focused on market diversification, but certainly we're seeing it really play out at three levels: market being one, second, sectoral diversification, and then third, business model diversification. And I think sorry, I just lost you there for a second. But I think for far too long, we've been very focused on that first part, on market diversification. I think the business model piece is really a third strategy around the export of capital, which is very challenging. But I think we have models from the US and from other countries which are not necessarily state-led capital flows out of the country, in particular into our region and into Southeast Asia, that we can look at to drive market development strategies. I'd like to hear from both of you on really a final question for me before I take a couple of questions that have come in from our participants. The role of the WTO. Do you see a role for them here in actually helping to mediate economic conflict? And do you think that there has been progress since the Biden administration has taken office? Wendy first, and then perhaps Jeff.
I'd like to be optimistic here. I think there is a role for the WTO, but the question is whether the WTO can step up and fulfill that role. And I'm not sure it can in this day and age. We did see during COVID, and I give Australia credit here, working with other medium-sized countries, a real effort to keep supply chains open and to ensure that at least medical goods could move, quickly without restriction between different countries. And their great initiative was never really picked up by others. I know that in the lead up to the late November, early December WTO ministers meeting, they're going to be looking at a COVID response. And so maybe they will pick up some of these threads. But I think the WTO is so challenged now, and any issues that bring in any kind of geostrategic or geoeconomic rivalry or any smack of competition, I think they're kind of doomed to failure given the members of the WTO. So in short, my answer is, yep, there is a role, but I'm not confident that that role will be filled by the WTO, which is will then mean countries will have to form their own coalitions trying to address a lot of the challenges we've been discussing tonight.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Wendy. I'd probably try and gloss that. And in discussion of the WTO, the way I try and think about this is that the WTO provides two functions for the global trade system. One is the thing that we often look at, which is its ability to negotiate new agreements. So the long-running saga of the Doha round that ultimately collapsed. Some of you, if you're avid WTO nerds, you may have followed the fisheries subsidies talks recently, environmental goods, a digital agreement that's going on. And those new negotiating functions, setting new rules in new trade areas, has certainly been badly compromised. I think it would probably be fair to say, Wendy, for 2 decades now, almost, really, in some way or another. But there's this other part of the WTO that's really important that everyone completely forgets about because we're so used to it, which is the bit that polices all of the trade agreements and trade rules we've already agreed over the last 60 years. This is the existing GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade Agreement, dating back to the late 1940s, as well as the WTO's dispute settlement functions as well. So you've got a legislative function of making new rules, but a kind of policing courts function of making sure that the things we've all already agreed are still adhered to. I think that is where, when we talk about some of these things, whether it's COVID or geoeconomics, that the WTO is really still important and still actually does function better than people think, in that this puts limits on the ability for countries to use trade wars for coercion. Australia has taken China to the WTO over barley and wine, and I'm very confident that the WTO is going to find in Australia's favour on this case. It limits the ability of countries to make knee-jerk protectionist responses to some of these COVID lockdowns and just say, okay, we're not selling anyone, we're putting an export restriction on X or Y or Z because our people are angry about it. And I think that actually buttressing that system, the judicial system, the police and court function of the WTO in this era is going to be a lot more significant. That's new because it's always been there. It's worked well for a half a century. It's got a taken for granted quality that we haven't appreciated up until now. But when you see this intersection of COVID and geoeconomics coming together in 2020, if I was thinking about how to answer Wendy's question of how can the WTO step up, it would be really standing behind that and saying we are going to keep a rule-based system to manage these things going forward. Even if some of those political differences means that we can't negotiate new rules, we can certainly make sure the ones we've already got are robust.
So maybe I can just respond there. And I totally agree. I think the dispute settlement function of the WTO is extremely important. It's not functioning now, and that's largely due to steps the United States has taken. But I think it's disingenuous to put in two different silos the negotiating function and a functioning dispute settlement system, because I think one of the core problems with the dispute settlement system, which led the U.S. to express concerns, was that the rules weren't keeping up with reality, and the panels, therefore, in dispute settlement proceedings were kind of making up the rules and interpreting rules based on what they think the rules should be in the absence of new rules being made. And so I think both really need to go hand in hand. But again, that said, I don't dispute the fact that the WTO does need a functioning dispute settlement system, and that system is really, a key role an important role the WTO can play.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, Jeff. I'm just going to build on that with an excellent question that's coming from one of our participants, who's asked, does the rise of geoeconomics as well as industrial policies more broadly mean that we're all converging on some model of state capitalism, where governments play a more significant role in directing economic activity, whether for strategic, economic, or environmental reasons? And I think that flows really well from your point in the WTO, whether governments feel they need to do more in the event that they can't actually find some form of mediation. Wendy and Jeff?
Well, maybe I'll kick this off. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a trend in the United States of just more government involvement, and you only have to look at the bill that's pending, that the Senate passed, that's pending in the House of Representatives, the Strategic Competition and Innovation Act, which includes money being given to different sectors, including the semiconductor sector, and just more government involvement. And I think that is necessary in today's world, particularly in a world where there's an unlevel playing field, with the second largest economy in the world having a state-led economy. Like, how, if you're a private company in the United States or Australia, how do you compete against a company in China, a state-owned enterprise that not only is getting financial assistance, but can't go bankrupt, really doesn't face the same risks. It doesn't answer to its shareholders in the same way. So this whole, idea of a level playing field, I think it's critical. And ideally, you would achieve a level playing field by getting China and other countries to agree to, a common set of rules. But we have failed in doing that. The United States tried to do that during the Trump administration in the Phase 1 trade agreement, made some incremental progress, but did not level the playing field. So if you can't get China to agree to the standards and the rules that you want, then the other response then is, okay, well, let us play, we can play the same game. But the challenge will be, and I think Jeff really made an excellent point earlier, is to achieve that balance, because part of being a market-driven economy has been the strength of the United States. That's what has bred innovation, new technologies, and just productivity. And so it's achieving the balance. But I, for one, I do see a role for the government now, given the realities of the international trading system.
Mm-hmm. Look, I think that's definitely true. And there's probably an old joke in trade policy that says the worst thing to be is the sole free trader in a world of protectionists, right? And so what Wendy's describing is precisely that. It's not really in our economic philosophy or ideology to do some of these things, but when you have large, systemically important countries like China, but by no means limited to China. This is a China story, but it's not only a China story. It's in some subsidies issues. For an Australian, we're in agriculture. The big subsidizer is the EU here. So we should de-China that analysis to some degree, but there is a little bit of, you have to be a little bit like the enemy to some degrees in these things. The key question, though, is like, where are we going to do this? And I think what's going to be important is for us to find ways to triage how that government involvement is going to work into the areas where it's critical. So during a pandemic, that some governments in the world have become directly involved in producing ventilators for hospitals or something like that. I don't think anyone would say that that was a bad idea. When just this becomes a routine and mundane part of non-critical parts of the economy, that's when we start transgressing on some of those market principles that are a result of dynamism in the first case. And there is a bit of a risk of letting the genie out of the bottle here, that we could potentially unleash some protectionist interests and rent seeking, that companies that might like government protection say, well, if the government's going to subsidise ventilators for hospitals, why can't they subsidise my product too? And I do worry that may create a political economic space for a return to some of those levels of industrial protection that, we've spent the last 50 years of the WTO over 3 generations, trying to just gradually chip away at. So the balance is going to be deciding where. government needs to get involved and how much. And a sectoral way to think about that's an interesting way. It's obviously a very long discussion as to which ones are in and out and things like that, but I'm sure a lot of people might have some views on, but really the way I try to think about this is how can we run the triage over this and say, if government needs to become a little bit more involved, how can we make that surgical in the right places to deal with the most pressing and critical problems?
And I would just add surgical and also like temporary and proportional.
I am very conscious of time, and really this conversation could go on for hours. It's been absolutely fantastic. I am conscious that we've had actually quite a few questions, and I just wanted to highlight that those of you that have raised questions on regional architecture, on policy issues, on the CPTPP, encourage you to have a look at Jeff's paper on adapting Australia to an era of geoeconomics competition, and to continue the conversation with Jeff. Wendy, we've had questions on the tool in particular, how the tool will work, how it will map different economies, and how it also presents those countries which already have certain strengths. So I'm going to encourage all of you to have a look at the tool, and I'm sure the team at Asia Society can send through more information so that you can continue the conversation with Wendy. And the third category of questions, a few have come in on digitalization in Southeast Asia. Please feel free to get in touch with me or with those from the Victorian government here. We're all doing a lot of work across countries, helping both businesses, but also interpreting the major blueprints for digitalization that are being presented by governments. For instance, the Malaysian Digital Economy Blueprint, which has only been released earlier this year. So very keen to keep this conversation going, but in the interest of time, I'm going to now invite Rebecca Hall, the Commissioner for Victoria, to Southeast Asia to provide a formal word of thanks.
Thanks a lot, Mukund, and thank you so much to our panel today, to Jeffrey and Wendy. I think Jeffrey, very early over there in Perth, if that's where you are based. So amazing to see that energy and insight coming from you so early in the morning. And Wendy, not late in the evening, hopefully your last meeting for tonight. My name is Rebecca Hall, and I'm joining you from, usually should be based in Southeast Asia as Victoria's Commissioner for the region, and looking forward to returning to the region in the next couple of weeks. We're delighted to partner with Asia Society, a broad partnership with Asia Society, but specifically around this most important topic of supply chains and in Indo-Pacific. So my task today is to issue a vote of thanks, and for the audience also, those who don't know Global Victoria, just to give you a little insight into the areas that we're working on. So yeah, on a Tuesday morning, to have that level of insight and knowledge and conversation has just been a great way to start the day. I know, having worked myself in trade program and strategy at a state and federal level, it's never been more important for us to understand the drivers, to understand the levers that we might have at our discretion, whether that be, and I think we unpack them very well, whether that be from government perspective, from business, or from other non-state actors. So Jeffrey, I think your way of explaining geoeconomics and also recognising why we're at the point we're at the moment, I think is really helpful for us to then look at what are the interventions that we can make, or how can we understand what's happening around us. So thank you for sharing your insights. Wendy, I think your optimism that came through a lot in your responses, but also your pragmatism in how we are going to be able to move forward. And I've just had a look at the tool online as well. What a fantastic and ongoing resource for us collectively to draw on. I acknowledge, as Mukund said, 10 of the ASEAN countries are included there. So we, from a state government perspective, will be looking closely at that tool. As I mentioned, I'm a vote of thanks for today, for this session, but also more broadly for the work that Asia Society does and the partnership that we hold here in Victoria. And I wanted to close this vote of thanks just by recognising and acknowledging Asia Society as part of Global Victoria's Trade Alliance, a newly announced program launched just last week, $4.7 million program. And Asia Society is one of 29 partners with us in that program of work. And it's about connecting our exporters to new markets, helping them adapt, helping our exporters adapt to export strategies that are relevant for the time, the geoeconomics of the time, and helping our exporters remain globally competitive. And the work that Asia Society and the insight that they're bringing to this is going to be critical for that. So I know we're coming very close to our 9 o'clock stop. So I'm going to hand back to the CEO of Asia Society, Philip Ivanov, to deliver the final word. Thanks, Philip.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. I really appreciate your kind words about Asia Society. We also really value our partnership with Victoria and with Global Victoria, and really interested to work with you on the Trade Alliance program. I think all our members and stakeholders are really invested and interested in these topics. Over the past 2 and a bit years, I think these issues of geoeconomic competitions have become a real challenge for many of the businesses. So really interested to explore it further through the Trade Alliance program. But first of all, of course, thanks to Wendy and Jeff and Mukund for helping us navigate this world of supply chains and geoeconomic competition. You can't do it, of course, in one event. That's why we're going to continue focus on this topic through our Trade Smarter strategy. Again, thanks to Global Victoria for supporting the event. Also want to thank our members for their continued support and for backing us, and hope you enjoyed today's event as much as I did. And those of you who are not yet members, clearly this is the best day to join Asia Society, and it's never been easier. Just go on our website and look for Become a Member button.